This time in the Prop Master, we finally get around to what? Oh, you thought that was going to be me. Now, this is just the reason why I cry a little bit on the inside every time I walk past a mirror while I'm wearing the suit. So before we get into it, just want to let you know, if you don't already, that I have a Tumblr page now called, of all things, The Prop Master. And it's a good place if you want to go there and just see how the schedule is going. If I'm about to post a video, if I'm finished filming, but starting editing, that kind of thing. It's just kind of keep tabs on when the next videos are going to come out. It's also a good place to see some other photographs of some of the things that I've made, as well as post some photos of the props that you've made, using my videos. I've had several people contact me trying to send me photos and not being able to, so this would be a great place to do that. So once again, just go to Tumblr and do a search for the Prop Master, and you should have no problem finding it. So now that that's out of the way, let's go ahead and talk about what's going to be in this video. Basically, I'm finally getting around to doing some of the little bits and bobs that go on the armor that, most people don't pay attention to, or you don't really notice when you're looking at everything. And I'm not talking about things like these belts. They are little bits and bobs, but they're not really part of the armor. They're just, they go on with Boba Fett. No, I'm talking about things like these little studs up here, and these little dart projectors and things that go on the knee armor. That's the kind of thing I'm working on. And this might be a good time to, reiterate that I'm not trying to make a accurate replica of the movie prop. I'm trying to stick in that basic vein, but a movie prop looks like a movie prop when you look at it close up. It's not that great generally. I want something that's going to look a little bit more real in real life, with a little bit more detail than you'd see in props. So there are some things that I'm going to do, including in this video, that will stray a little bit from the actual movie prop Boba Fett, and a little bit maybe look better in real life than the movie prop would. At least in my opinion. Also, that kind of goes with the fact that parts of this are very much in the style of Empire Strikes Back, while others are very much in the style of Return of the Jedi. So maybe this is from a time period in between the two. I don't know. I'm just trying to pick what I think looks good. If you want to go in a different direction in some of those things, you should still be able to follow my videos, just use a different pattern. I know, so this is like an Empire Strikes Back damage pattern, whereas in Return of the Jedi, I think there's like 2 dings here and some other stuff. It's just a little bit different. I'll try and from this point on let you know when I go different directions, just so you'll be aware. And I know this doesn't sound like a whole lot of work or very long, but it is a little over a 2-hour video, so let's get to work. Okay, so here are the little bits and bobs that still need to go onto the armor before we can really get around to weathering it. And mostly we have these parts here which go onto the knee armor. These are essentially the dart projectors. And in reality, we need 3 of these, preferably that are the same dimensions. This one is a bit larger. These little rings are a little bit thicker than these, and I think these smaller ones work a little bit better. And you're only going to need 1 of these spikes. I have 2 of them here. I've just been working on some different procedures there. And then, of course, you have these studs. These go on the shoulder parts of the armor. And you can buy resin versions of these on the internet. But to be honest, they don't seem to be You know, they don't seem to look that much better than the ones that we can make here. So I'll go ahead and show you, the process on how to make these. Like I said, we'll need 3 of these, 1 of these, and then 4 of these little studs. I still need to make 1 more, so I can go ahead and show you how to make those. These little projectors here are actually nothing more than, I've got this little 1/4 inch external diameter copper pipe and some of this flexible tubing, which is a 1/4 inch internal diameter, to go on top of it to make these here. These larger pieces are from some of this supposedly 1/4 inch internal diameter irrigation pipe, like for a sprinkler system for your house. And it seemed okay while I was doing it, but looking at it now, it just seems a little bit too much. These spikes and these are just made of wood, but let's go ahead and start working on those. Okay, so let's start by working on this piece here. This is a brass 1/2 inch external diameter nipple, which is just a fitting with threads on both ends. You're also going to need to go ahead and get a 1/2 inch dowel. Make sure you get a hardwood dowel and not pine. This is actually going to be mostly used when we make these parts here, but you'll also need this for the procedure of working on this part here. In fact, if you're not overly concerned with this being hollow, you can go ahead and make these out of the dowel as well, and just put a little black dot on the end. That also works quite well. Also have the flexible tubing with an internal diameter of a 1/2 inch. In this case, the external or outside diameter is 5/8 of an inch. But anything that's not too ridiculously thick. So you want to go ahead and take a pretty large section of your flexible tubing and slide it onto the dowel. And you don't want to just put a little bit of it on here. You want to get 18 inches or so on here. And the reason for this is that getting a square cut on this flexible tubing is exceedingly difficult. And the only way I've been able to do it is to slide it onto the dowel and then use a miter saw. And if you do just a little bit of the tubing on the dowel, it still ends up getting crooked. So you kind of have to do the entire length of a section of the dowel in tubing so that everything is perfectly square. And then when you cut it with the miter saw, you get a nice square cut. Now the length of this is 4 inches, but what we want is 2 7/16 of an inch of the pipe. That's roughly 6.2 centimeters. So I'm going to go ahead and cut a section of this that's that length without the threads. I keep saying 2 7/16, but to be totally honest, that's practically 2.5 inches, and 2.5 inches would be fine. I have this in a vise. I'm just going to mark a couple of marks. Now normally I would just cut this on the bandsaw real quick, but not everyone has a bandsaw, so a regular old hacksaw works just fine. Now notice that I have this clamped up on part of the pipe that I'm not going to be using, so I'm not worried about scratching it up too badly. I've just got a couple of thin pieces of wood, so now I can put more of the nipple into here. Just a different, much smaller hacksaw. Okay, yeah, the previous hacksaw blade was clearly very, very dull. Time for a new one, I guess. Okay. So I'm just going to clean this up a bit. Toasty. Okay, so here it is. I went ahead and cut the other end off with the bandsaw just because I could. You know, besides just a regular hacksaw or a bandsaw or a you know, some kind of other mechanical or some other kind of power saw that you can cut this with, you could also cut this with a pipe cutter, which, you know, would probably give you the cleanest cut, you know, and you could probably do this in less than a minute on each side, and they cost about $5, you know, to buy one. Unfortunately, I don't have one right now because I've loaned it off, and I'm not sure if I ever got it back. So here it is, and we need to go ahead and then do these pieces here. So I have my tubing on my dowel, and I need to cut 2 strips of it. One strip at 7/16 of an inch, which is roughly just a tad over 1 centimeter, like 1.1 centimeters. I also need to cut another piece off that is 5/8 of an inch, which is like 1.5 centimeters. And so we'll end up putting those on the miter saw and getting 2, you know, as close to perfect, you know, right angles cuts on here in those sizes. Okay, so the first thing I did is I went ahead and squared off this end so that it's not at a weird angle, and then I measured and made a mark at 7/16 of an inch, and I'll go ahead and cut that off. Okay, so here's my piece. I go ahead and set that down, and I'll make another measurement for 5/8 of an inch. Oh, and by the way, a manual miter box works just as well as power miter saw. And here's that piece. Oh, and by the way, you'll be wanting to do 3 of each of these, since you've got to do, you know, 3 of these. So we have these off. The next thing we want to do is we want to mark some measurements on here. And this is where you want to be really careful. The first measurement we want to make is 5/8 of an inch. And since I know that I just cut this at 5/8 of an inch, I can use that. Let me go ahead and back this up a little bit. Make things a little bit easier to get it on screen. Kind of helps to have something else that I can kind of okay, so that's nice and flush. And I can go ahead and make my, I'm going to go ahead and make sure that looks like it's the same. It does look nice and straight. So I'm going to go ahead and make a mark right there. I'm going to go all the way around with this mark too. Not the easiest thing to get off. So now I'm going to take this piece off. This is my 7/16 inch piece. And I'm going to try to get this on there. It really wasn't this hard with the other ones. I wonder if this particular casting is just a little bit large. Okay, now what I want to do here is I want to line this up as precisely as I can with this little line that I've just drawn. And that looks pretty good. So one of the problems that you have is that it's real easy to get this just a little bit crooked, and then it makes things very difficult. Next, I'm going to go ahead and measure out 1/4 of an inch from there. But I want to go ahead and mark this as well as I can and make marks all the way around it so that I can line up the next piece. Let me go ahead and get this back on. This one's definitely harder to deal with, which is just the way things usually go. It's all real easy when I'm just doing it, but once I get on camera, everything goes a little weird. And I want to try to line this up. Okay, that's looking pretty good right there. On your knee pad or your knee armor, you know, it's not going to be spinning around, so if there are some little inconsistencies there, it's not really going to be noticeable. In fact, I can tell you right now, this one's got some huge inconsistencies, but you don't really notice it unless you start moving it around. Now all we have to do is glue these in position. So in the past, I've kind of moved them out of the way and glued it and then pushed them back on, but a couple times they got stuck as soon as I put the glue on. So I'm going to try to just put some glue on here and see if it'll, you know, capillary effect, just suck the glue underneath there. Of course, this was so much tighter than the other one that it may not. I've just got some super glue and I'm just going to pour a little bit on each edge. I'm going to hit it with some of this zip kicker. You can also just, you know, wait a few minutes. This stuff smells terrible. Okay, so there's one. And we can go ahead and move on to this piece here. Okay, so here's our 1/2 inch dowel. I've cut it, or you know, part one. I've cut it into about a 3.5 inch piece. That's about 9 centimeters. And you know, we're going to cut this much smaller when we're done, but you know, by making it this size, we'll have lots of room to work. So the first thing I'm going to do is I want to mark a 1/2 inch from the edge here, because we're going to have to bevel, put a 1/2 inch bevel on here. A 1/2 inch is about 1.3 centimeters, maybe something like that. Doesn't have to be exact. So I'll put a mark on there. I'm just going to put a mark on there that's easier to see a little bit. I don't know if that's easier to see or not, but. Now, I could, to get this bevel, of course, if you had a 1/2 inch wide pencil sharpener, that would be ideal. And I could lock this in the vise and draw this circle around and go ahead and, you know, file all the way around and eventually get, you know, roughly what we want. But here's the secret. If you take just a regular drill and lock this into there. Now I can put this in a vise. I'm just going to lightly lock this in the vise. Now, there's my line, and I can take a file or my sanding stick. Camera's in my way a little bit here, and I keep doing that. I'll go ahead and make that a bevel, but there's even a quicker way to do this. Okay, so this is just the disc sanding part of my belt sander, and what I'm going to do is just going to put this on, start it, and then I'll hold it up against this disc while it's turning, and it'll make fairly quick work of this. Now when I'm doing this, I'll be watching that edge, and as my beveled edge gets to this little line, that's when I'll go ahead and stop. And there you go, a very nice even edge, nice straight line across here, nice point here. Now I'm going to go ahead and file that sharp point off so it's a little bit blunt, which is the way the actual prop is as well. But that's how you do that. Now if you don't want to get a drill and a belt sander and that kind of stuff, there's one other way that you can go about getting this part, but I'll go into that a little bit later. So now that I have this piece beveled, I've got my drill back in my vise, and I'm just going to smooth it out. So I have various little bits of sandpaper here. I've got some 220 grit, I've got some 800 grit, and I also have a piece of 1000 grit here somewhere. And here we go, I've got a piece of 1000 grit as well. So I'm just going to, I don't have a way to lock this on unfortunately, so I'm just going to hold it on and take my various bits of sandpaper and just smooth this out really good. You know, basically we're getting this ready for paint. You know, the main reason we want to use a hardwood on this is so that we don't have big grain issues when we're trying to paint this. Let's go ahead and switch over to the 800 grit. It's going to be very smooth now. It feels like plastic or or metal. I mean, it's really glass smooth right now. So I think we're smooth enough. I'm just going to take my 120 grit sanding stick, and basically what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to flatten this sharp point, maybe a little bit more than that. Okay, that looks pretty good. Okay, now we can go on. This piece is now ready for paint. So now we're ready to go ahead and start working on these little studs. Now you're going to need 4 of them. I have 3 already, so I need to go ahead and make 1 more. Now, I'll be honest, these things kind of threw me for a loop, and I wasn't really sure what they did for a long time. I really thought they had a loop of material that came out of the bottom of them, mostly because I've seen some old Anglo-Saxon armor that's held together with little studs like this in that way. Also, the attaching a scabbard onto a belt with a nut like this and a loop that you can move around things, and then it hooks back around the nut. So I kind of thought that this would go through a slot in the front of the armor, and then a slot, come out the slot at the back of the armor, and then loop over the top of this, and that would hold everything together. But after a lot of work, I finally found out the way they actually did it for the prop, and it's a lot simpler, luckily. And essentially, it's just, these are like a nut. There's a screw that comes up through the two different pieces of armor, and this screws down and holds everything in place. But we'll get more into that later on. Right now, we just kind of need to know how to make them. So basically, for these, you're going to need, this is a 1 by 1.5, or it may be labeled as a 1 by 2 board. The important thing is that it's in reality 3/4 of an inch tall or thick here. As long as it's more than a 1/2 inch thick this way, it's not really that important. So, since it's already been milled and everything, it's a 1 by, but it's only 3/4 of an inch thick. And that's the important part. This is poplar. You're going to want to use poplar, or, if you don't have poplar available, some other very fine grained wood. Even something like oak is going to be more difficult. Pine would be completely out of the question. But poplar, or whatever you have available that's got a very fine grain, like a maple or something like that, would also work, but it's going to be, maple being so much harder is going to be more difficult. So poplar, or even like a low density or medium density fiberboard would probably work. Just something that doesn't have a real obvious grain. And this is a pretty good size to work with. But I had to buy 6 feet of this. You obviously don't need that much. But you want to, or what it really comes down to, you're going to need to add some threads to this in some way. And there's 2 basic ways. These little T-nuts, I think, have worked out the best. Originally, I tried using these little insert nuts. See if I can get one of these to come out. This just threads in with a fairly coarse thread here, and then it has a fine thread on the inside. The problem I had with these is they tend to, no matter how straight I drill the hole in the wood, they tend to somehow get cocked a little bit one way or the other, and they're just not in straight. And if they're not pretty close to, 90 degrees from this axis, you end up with a kind of a cocked nut. I mean, you're trying to screw that in, it doesn't really work. This is a little better because it has this base part that keeps it, 90 degrees. So I just found that this ended up working a lot better. I was afraid this would be too big, but I found these M5 by 0.8 metric. They don't have to be metric, but just something that's small enough. Works just fine. You can see that it fits on here with plenty of wood all around it. If you do end up going with this style, don't get the brass. The brass is just too brittle. Every one that I used, I ended up these little parts where you screw this part in. In every case, one of them broke off. So you'll need to use some sort of insert. I really like these T-nuts. The M5 is a good size. It's just going to be a strong enough screw that goes in here. These are 14 millimeters long. So what we want to go ahead and do is first we need to go ahead and find the center of this 3/4 of an inch and draw a line there. Go ahead and pull this out a little bit. So 3/8 of an inch. And it moved on me, of course. Okay. Now that I have my center line here, I want to go ahead and drill a hole for this. Now these are 1/4 of an inch size. They're metric, but it just works out to also be 1/4 of an inch. I just measured that. So I have a 1/4 of an inch bit, and I measured the height of this little shaft here. A little closer there. Just so that these will only end up being 1/2 of an inch tall, so you don't want to drill so much that it comes out the top. So I measured that, and then I just put a piece of tape. When you're measuring from your bit, you want to measure from the shoulder here, not from the tip, because if you measure from the tip, your hole's not going to be deep enough for this to fit in fully, and it's going to split the wood. And you don't want to measure this out first. You want to just somewhere in the middle here. What I'm trying to do is avoid having this so small that when we try to put these in there, that it just splits, destroys the wood. So I'm just going to come out here a little ways and go ahead and drill that. And that did not. Okay, let me grab something real quick. This is just a little center punch that I got at Home Depot. Not very impressed with it, to be honest. The point doesn't seem to be that hard, and it doesn't really have it's supposed to be spring loaded, but it doesn't seem to be very strong, and it doesn't work very well for metal, but it should work just fine for this wood. So I'm going to give it a little bit of room there. Let me see if I can. So not so good for metal, but it works fine for wood. And now maybe I'll be able to get this in the right place. You want to make this as straight as possible. That seems good. Now before I just drive this into here, which I could do that, but it's probably going to split this wood on the two sides. So I'm going to put this in a vise real quick, just so that it can't split the wood apart. Okay, so I just have this put in the clamp. I've got a couple of pieces of wood on either side so I can really tighten it down. I really don't have to do that because I'm going to sand the sides off of this, but you know, why not? So I can just set this. I want to go ahead and get it so that I don't want to put it like this, just because the little things that cut in are going to run more along with the grain of the wood. This way it's going to be going, you know, diagonally. Plus it's a little bit further away from the edges this way. But the vise should hold the wood in from splintering. And I've just got a hammer, I'm going to tap it in. And that should be good enough. It looks like it just doesn't want to go all the way, so it's not going to split at this point because it's most of the way in. I'm just going to use the vise to kind of help this get in there flush. Okay, so that's nice and flush. Now we just need to draw our 1/4 inch from the center out each side. In fact, probably would have been better to go ahead and draw the box and then set this into the middle of it, but you know, either way really works. Okay, so I'm just going to line this up here and just kind of center this in a 1/4 or in a 3/4 of an inch. Just got a square. You don't have to use a square, just, you know, a piece of paper will give you a 90-degree edge or 90-degree angle. Okay. And like I said before, it might be a good idea, and you know, when you do it, draw your center line and then give yourself plenty of space in between them, but go ahead and I guess I probably should have gone ahead and drawn the center point as well at the same time. There's just plenty of room in between these. You know, from there you could go in. Mark your center point, drill your hole, put in your insert, you know, do that 4 times, and then we can go ahead and cut these out real quick. You can cut them out using whatever saw you prefer, whether it be a hand saw or chop saw or band saw, skill saw, you know, whatever. So go ahead and cut this part out real quick. Okay, so I've cut these sections off, so now I've got these kind of long skinny things. All I want to do now is I want to draw a line that's a 1/2 inch from here to the line. You don't have to use a square. If you know, make 2 measurements like I did there, you can just connect the lines. So I'm going to go ahead and cut these off and I'll be right back. Okay, so here are my little blocks now. Roughly 3/4 of an inch square and a 1/2 of an inch tall. Now you just want to measure 1/8 of an inch in on all sides. A smaller ruler would definitely be helpful. Another easy way to do that is to grab a, I want to say a caliper, but these are not calipers. This is something I can't think of what these are called. Well, I'll just set that for 1/8 of an inch. And there I have the size. I'm just going to check these. Close enough. And what we're going to do now is we're just going to file these edges so that they're still this size at the bottom, but to there at the top. And so let's go back to the vise real quick. Okay, so I have my block in my vise again. And once again, I've got some little pieces of wood here to, in between the block and the vise. But this time, instead of trying to stop me from marring the wood, I mostly just need space for the file to fit in here. And all I'm going to do is I'm just going to file from this line at the top down to this bottom edge at the bottom. This is very similar to some of the stuff that I did on the Boba Fett helmet on the earpieces. So if you're familiar with that, you're not going to be able to see anything from this angle, are you? I noticed that I'm getting a little too close to this edge right here. Trying to show that better. This little edge right there. If I'm getting too close to that too quickly, I'll just change my angle a little bit more upright so that I'll start getting closer to this edge first. And let's see if I can find a little better angle here. Not a lot better, but maybe a little bit better. The biggest problem with this angle is that the camera is now right where I kind of need to be. You can also use, I've got my 60 grit sanding stick here. You'll find that when you're doing this method, you're probably going to end up with a little bit of a curved edge. But to be honest, it's not really noticeable. And there's one edge. Now, as you go along, it gets more difficult because you end up with these little angled edges and it's harder to get a grip on it. What you generally have to do at that point is switch over to doing it like this. And I need to go this way, but if I do this, I'm going to hit the camera. So it's making it very difficult to film. But as you might have guessed, there is a quicker way, an easier way. This angle turns out to be 15 degrees. So if you want to use a miter saw or a band saw or a sanding disc sander, now is a good time to do that. Okay, so here we are back at the disc sanding part of our belt sander. And because of the angle, I've got the table here set at 15 degrees. And because of the direction that we want this to be, unfortunately what we have to do is put this upside down. And we'll feed this in. We're not going to be able to really see what it's doing to this part here, but we'll feed this in until this top edge is just barely touching evenly all the way across. Once again, it's a terrible angle. Let me see if I can find a better spot. Okay, this looks a little bit better. It's about time to change out my disc, I'm afraid. Okay, so now we have matching angles. We have a little bit of a problem in that as we do this more and more, we're getting less and less area, you know, that's keeping us straight. So you really have to push down and make sure that you're staying flat on this table while you're doing it. You notice how I slow down as I get up toward this edge just to make sure that I, you know, do it until I'm just barely touching evenly across the top of the piece like that. Once I get to there, then I stop. I don't want to come in, you know, at an angle, and not only will that change the shape down at the bottom, but it kind of changes the shape everywhere. So that went quick. Okay, and then we have our little stud. We need to go ahead and hit this with some fine sandpaper and try to get it as smooth as absolutely possible. Okay, so I just got some different sandpapers here. This is my 120 grit sanding stick, and I've got some 220 paper here and some 600 paper here. And I'm just going to, you know, basically putting the sandpaper on the ground and moving this along it. The main thing I'm trying to do here is just get rid of any evidence that this is wood. I want this to be really smooth and fine. I don't want there to be any wood grain showing. Now color-wise, obviously there's going to be wood grain showing, but I don't want, you know, to be able to feel any of it or see it once we paint it a solid color. Try to be careful while you're doing this to keep it nice and flat. You don't want to change the angles at all. This is the same grit paper, just a different type and brand. You don't have to push down real hard, just lightly. Also helps to make sure you rotate it in the same direction each time so that you don't end up going back over the same one twice and not over, you know, the one you want to go over. Once you get into the finer sandpaper, you might be a good time to go ahead and kind of round off some of these corners that are really sharp. Although it's usually a little bit easier to do when you're holding this in your hand and using a file or a sharpening stick, sanding stick I should say. You don't want to round them off too much, you just want it not to be a sharp edge. Okay, so there we have these. We already have this piece and this piece, and we can go ahead and get ready for paint. Okay, so let's get ready to paint these, and I just want to secure everything down. And these little things have a tendency to go flying around when you spray paint them. So I've just taken a piece of thin plywood. You could use cardboard or paper even. Well, maybe not paper, but you know, cardboard or some scrap wood, whatever you've got. And I'm just going to take some of this foam double stick tape. Stick to the bottom. And make sure there's plenty of room between the two of them. And stick it down. I've just got a pair of vice grips. Grab onto this, that'll keep it where I can paint it. And the same thing on this. When you do this, just make sure that you grab it on the end that has the smaller of the two bulges, you know, little pieces that are on here. This is the end that'll get hidden, and this is the end that sticks out. So those are stuck down, and that's held firmly in place. I mean, you don't have to use vice grips. You could just, you know, tape this down to, in fact, you could, I suppose, just, since most of this is going to get cut off, you could just tape this standing upright onto this piece of wood. But, you know, I've got it, so I'm going to go ahead and hold on to them with those. So you don't really need to do this part, but for these wooden parts, I really want to, you know, make sure that the grain does not show through. So I've got some sanding sealer, and I don't know why I never thought about this in the past, but I didn't. And then I saw the guys over at Punished Props doing this when they were working on a dagger. And I just kind of like, why didn't I ever think of that before? I wish I had done that on some of the wooden parts of the Boba Fett helmet. So I've just got some of that sanding sealer, and I'm just going to brush it on to my parts here. Like I said, these small pieces like this, I don't know that this is really helping us at all, but you know, I'm going to go ahead and go for it because I'm going to do what I can. If you don't have any sanding sealer or don't want to get any sanding sealer, then don't worry about it. And once you're sure you've got plenty on there, go ahead and smooth everything out. Now you're probably thinking that we should have done this before we sanded everything, but in both cases we ended up, you know, sanding these angles into it, and this stuff won't penetrate that deep, so we need to make sure that we shape these before we put this on. Okay. And now I need to wait an hour for this to dry, and then we can go on from there. Okay, so it's been over an hour now, and I just want to lightly sand everything with some, you know, around a 220 grit. You don't want to sand it so much that you sand through the sealer. So very light pressure. Now I'm also going to go over it a little bit with this 600 grit. And for this one, I'm just going to go ahead and put it in the drill again real quick. I'm going to go very quickly to the 600 grit. Here's some 800 grit. Now if I put any pressure at all on this, it'll go right through that sealer and just take it right off. But that's super smooth. Okay, and now all of these are ready for primer. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to spray on some of this 2-in-1 filler. It's both filler and primer. You don't have to use this brand, just some sort of filler primer. Not just primer, but the filler actually is going to fill in any low spots. Once again, I'm just trying to hide any sign of any wood grain. I'm going to put 3 coats on here, 2 very light coats, and then a 3rd sort of medium wet coat. I'm going to let it dry for 10 minutes in between each coat. Don't worry about the tops. You're going to hit the top about, every time you hit a side, you're going to put a little bit of paint on the top. So. And for these, I'm going to go ahead and just pick them up. Be sure to get the top and bottom of these little ridges that are on here. The flexible hose, we want to get the ends of it as well as the sides of it. Also the end here. I'm going to get some primer on the vice grips, but that's okay. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and clear this out by turning it upside down and letting it spray until no paint comes out. And I'll wait 10 minutes and come back and put on another light coat. Okay, it's been 10 minutes and it's time for the second coat. And this time I remembered to put on my dust mask. Okay, 10 more minutes and we'll put on a heavier coat. Okay, now for the 3rd medium wet coat. Now don't put it on so thick that you get a run, because that's going to kind of ruin everything. Although you can at least sand over a run. At this stage anyway. Just do want to make sure that everything gets coated. Okay. Go ahead and wait 10 minutes for that to cure and we'll take a look at it. Well, it's been about 40 minutes since that last coat. There's a minimum wait time on that for 30 minutes after the 3rd medium wet coat goes on before you can actually sand it. And it says you can sand it with a 600 grit sandpaper. And I want to be pretty light with this. because I really don't want to remove all of this primer. I just want to make sure that it's nice and smooth. I'm just using my fingers and thumb to remove any dust. I'm not worried about any wood grain or anything like that on here, obviously, so I'm just, if there's any rough areas, I want to lightly sand those. And you guessed it, for this one I'm going to go ahead and lock it back into the drill. Okay, so I'm not going to use the 600 grit on this. I'm going to use some of this 1000 grit, just because this is going to be spinning so much faster. I did very little pressure on there at all. Okay, so now we're ready to go ahead and put on our first coat of paint. Okay, so now that everything has been sanded and is as smooth as I can get it, I'm ready to start adding some color. And I'll let you in on a little secret that I picked up from Adam Savage on his YouTube channel. And that is, if you want something to be a really shiny metallic silver, your first step is to paint it a gloss black. This is just a Krylon product. I've noticed that Krylon paints do dry quicker, so that's one plus. And I just want to do a light coat. It's really all it should need. The thing is, when you're painting this, you don't want to go on so thick you get a drip, because then, I mean, this is not, we're past the stage where we can sand things out. So if you get a drop, you know, something starts to drip on here, you're gonna have to start all over. This is more difficult because I have to get, you know, the top of these little ends and the bottoms without getting too much paint, you know, on the sides of everything. Hopefully that was mostly in the camera when I did that. Now for this paint, it says that you can reapply more paint anytime in the next 2 hours. Beyond that, you have to wait 48 hours. So I'm gonna wait about 30 minutes for this to all dry, at least, you know, dry to the touch, and then I can go ahead and start adding the silver. So it's been about 30 minutes, and yeah, it's definitely dry to the touch. And it's time to go ahead and apply the silver or chrome paint. Now I've found that most silver chrome spray paints, no matter how shiny the lid is on them, is really sort of a sad approximation of any kind of, you know, silver or chrome. It tends to be a somewhat shiny, dull gray, to be honest. The two things that I found that are quite shiny is, this is what I usually use, or have used in the past, which is a Rust-Oleum mirror effect. Now there's a label that looks very similar to this, that instead of saying mirror effect, says metallic. You don't want to use that. You want to make sure it's the Rust-Oleum mirror effect. Another product that I also picked up on from Adam Savage's channel is this Krylon Premium Metallic Original Chrome. And it might be slightly brighter even than the Rust-Oleum that I have. So I'm going to go with this. It seems to work pretty darn well. And before we do that, now is a pretty good time to bring up, I had mentioned before that there was another way to go for this piece here. And that is, if you remember this little center punch that I used earlier that I was not very happy with. Well, it's not a great center punch, but it is just about the perfect shape to replace that piece. It's pretty much the right size. It even has a nice, interesting shape to it. I like the little knurling here. It'll give it an interesting effect. And it already comes gloss black. So I'm going to go ahead and spray paint that with the chrome and see how that looks as well. And this was like $7, I think. And it is the you'll recognize it. It's at Home Depot. It's a Husky product. You may find something similar at Lowe's or some other places. Just, keep an eye open for this shape, basically. Just happen to have one more pair of vice grips. Now, I could just unscrew this part right here. This is about the right size, so I could just use this little bit of thread here, but I'd like to get a little bit more, so I think what I'll do is I'll go ahead and screw this back in, and I'll just use a hacksaw to cut somewhere down here. I'll measure it and make sure it's the same height as the other piece and cut it about there. But let's go ahead and paint these. The other thing I'll say somewhat negative about the Krylon is I couldn't find it anywhere, and I had to order it online, but it only took them about 2 days to deliver it to me, so it was still pretty good. Now here's the thing, you don't want to go on real thick with this. I want to just very lightly spray this on. I'm about a foot away. I'm going to very lightly dust this, and I'm just going to spray it on there until it gets, as much shine as I want. I don't know if you can actually see any of this or not. If you get too much of this on, it starts to lose its shine. Okay, that looks pretty darn shiny to me. It's looking pretty good. And finally, let's see how this works. So that looks quite nice. And this says that it'll be dry enough to handle in 2 hours. So we'll go ahead and let it dry. Yeah, I could take a hair dryer and kind of go over this just to
speed things up a little bit. This does have the advantage of, this says you can go ahead and put a second coat on at any time, but I think I'd probably go ahead and still wait for the 48 hours from the glossy black, just because I've seen some very strange reactions with paint if you don't follow those directions. So, and I think this looks like a good coat. I'll just go ahead and leave it like this, and in 2 hours we'll take a look at it. While we wait for that to dry, let me turn my attention to something else that I feel like I need to deal with. These knee pads or knee armor, I'm fairly happy with them, but when you put them on, they tend to kind of sag down. If my hand is my actual knee, they, instead of being like that, they seem to be more like that. And that's mostly due to the fact that when I attached these snaps here, back here, I guess what I should have done was to pull all of the material of the pants forward so that, you know, the pants themselves were tight, and then mark these. But I didn't do that. So what I'm going to do is, where I have this strap that is primarily just to gather up the pants leg, I'm going to go ahead and put a second snap in right here opposite this one. That way that will also help to secure the knee pad securely to my leg. Like I say, if I had pulled all the material of the pants leg forward, so this was held back against my knee when I had the pants on, you wouldn't have to do that, but you know, this is good insurance. So in order to do that, the first thing I need to do is to remove this paint and everything the way I have it here, so that when we glue this down, it's not going to just pull the paint up. This is that same material like I did when we were attaching all the other armor and these snaps here. It's a little thinner. I just made it the same width as this, you know, aluminum bar. And you know, you just make it twice this long, put one coat of barge cement on, wait 8 to 10 minutes, put a second coat on, wait 8 to 10 minutes, fold it over, and then went ahead and put this snap through it. And I want this to be in the same basic place as this one over here. So I kind of aim the snap to be there, and then I'm just going to take a pencil and mark where this is going to be. And I just need to remove that material, and you can do that in several different ways. I've just got a little chisel here. This works fairly well. I want to be fairly gentle here, because if it slips, I don't want to drive this through my hand. You could also use a Dremel tool to, you know, grind that off, or some files, or even sandpaper if you want to spend the time doing it. But that seems to work pretty well. A razor blade would have worked just as well. Probably would have worked easier, because I wouldn't have had this long shaft, and I could have just, you know, slid it around there, and it would have cleaned off a little bit easier. But now that I have that, I'm just going to put on, these should be well sealed with the barge cement now, and obviously nothing's going to sink into this aluminum, so I should be able to get away with just one coat of barge cement. And you know what I'm going to say now? Of course, I have not put on my gloves. It's just become tradition now. Okay, so now I have my gloves on. Sorry. Blocking your view as usual. Okay, so I'll wait about 8 to 10 minutes, and then we can go ahead and check on those and then put them on. It's been 8 minutes. Oh yeah, this is barely even tacky. So let's go ahead and see if we can attach this. You could also, of course, just take all this off and, you know, glue this strap down to the back, but this would always be pulling to try to peel that up, whereas by doing this, it's pulling this from the middle, so it's not, you know, peeling it up. So this will be a little bit stronger, I think, or at least more durable. Okay, so now all we need to do is to add the opposite piece into the strap itself. Okay, so let's go ahead and attach this other half of the snap. I'm being careful not to stretch this out, but I do want it to lay right up against here and not be pulled tight like that. I want it to be more like this. And I'm just going to mark this location right here. A marker would probably be a little easier. Do the same on this one. Make sure that when you mark this, you mark it on the, you know, not on this part up here, but make sure you mark it on this down here. Okay, so now I just have the other half pieces. Okay, so this is the part that snaps onto here, so we know that it's going to be like this. So just make sure you put this on the right side, because that's totally the kind of thing that I would put on the wrong side. There we go. Now this will hold everything nice and tight. Repeat the process on this side here. I can see the dot on there, so I know it's lined up. And there's that side as well. Now, as soon as the silver dries, we'll take a look at that. Okay, so these are dry enough to touch. Some of them are still a little bit tacky, so I don't want to hold them too much. But they're looking pretty good. Looks like these that I just did, I made a little bit tall. They're a little bit taller than a 1/2 inch, and so they have a smaller, you know, the top part's just a little bit smaller than these ones that I made before. So if it starts to bother me, I can always sand these down a little bit closer to a 1/2 inch tall and paint them again. This looks pretty good. Definitely looks metallic, even the part that's not. This also looks good. Not, to me, not quite as good as this piece here. This just looks a little bit more detailed. You really wouldn't notice this in a movie, but in real life, I think it might look a little bit better. And it kind of goes to the scale of these. You know, these are really designed to show up, you know, on a movie screen, but they're pretty big. This will fit in here. It'll be flush with the bottom of this little ridge right here. So it's going to stick out quite a ways. These here only stick out to about there, so they'll stick out about that far. But like I said, that's kind of a big old honking thing sticking out there. Oh, before I get on too far, here is a version of that that is made out of a dowel with just a black dot drawn at the end, and that also looks pretty good if you want to go that route. But there is one other way to do this if you don't want to go to the trouble of this, and that is one of these. This is just a little quick connector, pneumatic system quick connector, like you'd hook a pneumatic air tool up to a compressor. And you've got a hose with this on the end of it, and you know, locks in place there and then pops off. It's, you know, the right basic shape and everything. It's even, you know, pretty much the right diameter, but you know, it's much shorter. But it might, you know, it depends on what you think about it. It might be a little bit better size. You know, it wouldn't show up very good in a movie, or as good in a movie, but it might look better in real life than one of these big old things here. But you know, it's up to you. If you want to make sure that if you're trying to make a duplicate of the movie prop, then you want to go with this, or if you just like it better. Otherwise, you might want to go with one of these. Just make sure you get the largest ones. It's like they come in smaller sizes, and this shape is the automotive style. They also have a different style that has a much smaller, little sharper edged little thing that sticks out here instead of this larger piece here. So let's talk about actually attaching these pieces to the armor. Okay, so let's start out by dealing with these little studs here. Now, if you recall earlier in the video, I talked about how I didn't really understand how these worked early on. And that's a shame, because I probably would have done things a little bit differently if I really understood the way these worked. I probably would not have put these snaps on for the back. And, you know, I probably would have made the back, these little parts of the back here, 1.5 inches to 2 inches shorter, and then made the front part 1.5 inches to 2 inches longer. The downside of that is they wouldn't necessarily line up with the seams, and you know, would have made things more difficult as far as lining everything up. But you know, you could always measure from the seam back 2 inches and draw a line there. And the reason why I say that is because I think this looks a little bit better with these little studs back here toward the back of your neck, or you know, this part back here, as opposed to being so far forward. In the actual prop piece, they're attached to this front plate here, but this plate goes further back,
and actually just lays on top of the back plate because they're much thinner. I don't, we can't do that obviously at this point. And I think if you made this, these pieces are 1/4 of an inch thick. If you made them lay on top of each other, it would be a pretty recognizable overlap. It wouldn't look as good. So what I've done instead is I've made a piece that I've just glued to the bottom of the back and then slides up underneath. And then that's how we'll go ahead and put holes here and secure it like that. So let's talk about this material right here. You can really use anything you want that's going to be strong enough to hold these together. Leather would be a good choice. Another good choice would just be the same fabric that we've been using all along to attach the snaps on. If you made about 3 thicknesses of this together, it would be quite strong. What I've used is a thermoplastic called Worbla, and it's if you just do a Google search for Worbla, you'll find it online pretty easily. It's pretty amazing stuff, I have to admit. I haven't done much with it until now, but it's pretty fun stuff. It comes in a roll like this. I've just cut off a piece here. This piece that I've cut off is just about 3 inches. It's just about 3 inches here by about 7.5 inches long. And that's what I'm going to use to make this little piece that fits in between these two, the front and the back armor pieces. And to work with this, you just take your heat gun, just like you would with the foam, Now this is actually made for crafting, so it does not release any toxic fumes when you heat it up. So that's a good thing. Okay, so now it's definitely heating up. It's getting kind of floppy. Set that down. And what's really cool about this stuff is that not only is it extremely flexible, it's sticky. So you don't need to glue it. I just fold this over. Push down and it will glue itself together. And also, while it is flexible, you can just lay it down on your shoulder to get the right shape. I'm going to go ahead and use my real shoulder here instead of that. I don't know if you can. Let me see if I can rotate this over. And just set this on my shoulder. Probably should do it under your shirt, but this will be fine. And just hold it there and let it cool off, and it'll get quite stiff. In case you can't see that. Now you don't need very much of this, so if you can, buy just a sample or just a small piece of it, or a small roll, that would be plenty.
Okay, so now this is cooled off. It's quite rigid. And I can't really, if I tried really hard, I could probably bend that, but it would just go back where it was. So now's a good time to go ahead and mark this as to which way is, out away from your head. The marker would work a little better. This is just so that you don't get it mixed up and then it doesn't quite fit right on your shoulder. So I'll always know that this goes out that direction. And as you can see, I just kind of rounded these corners over so that it wouldn't be a sharp edge. Okay, so now as you can see, because I've had these snaps already here, I had to cut out sections, in both cases, so that the snaps wouldn't, interfere. And I wanted to do this so that you could just see it, but when I was doing my testing, I accidentally put this on the wrong side, so I had to go back and do the other side, and so now I end up with a piece already there. So, I take this piece, just lay it down, mark around your snaps if you already have them, and then go ahead and use barge cement to glue this in place. And I know I don't have to tell you how to use barge cement at this point. And then you just want this to stick out about 1 inch. And, as long as this is definitely like 3 inches and in the middle, you'll be fine. Have it come out about 1 inch. As you can see on this other side, you have a little different shape on that one. But I just, once again, I just cut the corners off. And once you have that glued in place, you want to make sure you trim this so that it's not interfering with the snaps that are on your front piece also. In my case, my snaps were very far down, so it wasn't a problem. But if your snaps are closer up, unfortunately, if they're right up against the edge, you might actually have to move them. So hopefully you've watched this video before you've put those snaps on, and you won't put them right up against the edge. So I'm going to go ahead and snap this in place. Okay, so you don't really have to have put this up here yet. You could just do this without it being on your dummy. But I want to measure 1 inch from this inside corner. And I want to mark that. I'm going to go ahead and draw a line right there. And I'm going to take my stud, and I'm just going to center it on that line, but flush against the back of the armor. And I'm going to trace around it. Okay? And then I can pick either this line or this line, and I'm going to measure down 2 inches from there. It's just that if I pick this up line, measure 2 inches, that's going to be the highest edge of this stud that I can line up. Once again, I want the stud to line up with the back of the armor. And I'm going to go ahead and trace around that. Now I can just take any straight edge. I'm going to go from one corner to the other corner diagonally, and then do the other 2 corners. And that'll give me my center point where I'm going to drill the hole. do the same thing up on this one. It doesn't have to be 100%, just, you know, close enough to look good. And I'll mark that. Let's go ahead and pull this off now. Okay, so here is the screw that I'll be using. It is the matching screw to the threaded socket that we put in the nut or the stud. In this case, it is a M5 0.8 by 14 millimeters. Just make sure it's the one that fits into the stud you've got. And then you want to select a bit that is slightly bigger, big enough that you'll be able to slide the armor, you know, onto this little, you know, screw that's sticking up. If you get it the exact same diameter, it's going to be hard to put the armor on. Okay, so now take a center punch or just something that's really sharp. I've got a scratch awl here. And I just want to line it up where it's supposed to go, and I'm going to, you know, put a little hole in there so that my drill will go in the right place. Do that on both of these. And going in as straight as I can, go ahead and drill a hole. Okay, so now you have your holes there. Let's go ahead and put the back armor where it goes. We wouldn't have to do the top, but since I do have snaps in the top, I'm going to go ahead and put those on here. Now I can take this piece, snap it in place. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold these two pieces to where they are perfectly lined up. And take a marker or a nail, or in this case a scratch awl. Now to make sure that I can mark that. Okay, so now go ahead and take the back armor off again. Of course, if you're using Sintra for the back armor, or if you just really want these studs to be back toward the back here, you could switch this around and attach the studs onto the back. I just didn't necessarily want to do that with the foam because I was afraid it might put a lot of stress on the foam. It's probably would be just fine, or you could even just reinforce the foam with something. If you glue some more of that fabric on the back side of it, that might make it strong enough. I'm going to go ahead and put mine on the front.
Okay, so this time you want to use a drill bit that is just the right size. So this drill bit is the same size as the screw. I want to go ahead and drill these holes here. Preferably not through my finger. Now, obvious, if you're doing this in leather or in that fabric, you're going to want to, you're not going to be able to drill the hole through, but just punch a hole that's the right size. Now, needless to say, if you're using a smaller screw, maybe with a smaller head, you're going to want to put a washer on here. In fact, you can see here where I have one of this larger size, and then for the other stud that I made, I was using that other little screwed insert. It's a much smaller screw, so I put a washer on there so it won't be tempted to pull through here. I'll eventually get this visible. And you want this to be fairly snug. But just before it gets all the way in here, I'm going to take a little bit of super glue. You could use epoxy or whatever you have. Super glue is not the greatest for this, just because, if you try to unscrew that screw, it's going to be shear, and that's the one way that super glue is not very strong. If you try to pull it off of something, it's extremely strong, but if you try to slide it along something, it's not very strong that way. Or I should say that's its weakest. But it still should hold that pretty securely. Let's do that one more time. Let's unscrew this one a little bit. The reason why I'm doing it like this is because I don't want to get any super glue on the threads. That was a lot of super glue. And then tighten this up. And then wait for that to dry, or I'm going to go get my super glue kicker, and that also has the advantage of making it where I don't glue my fingers to this thing. So this has been a fairly complicated procedure to explain, but it's pretty simple in practice, and I think now that you've seen me do it, you won't have any trouble doing it yourself. Okay, now that I have this all done, I may never take that piece off this vest again. I don't know. Looks like I need to clean this little hole out just a little bit. There it goes. That's why you want these holes to be a little bit bigger than the screw themselves, because otherwise they'll just won't go through. Okay, so now that I have those in place, I can go ahead and snap. Okay, so now I just take my studs . Here's my new studs. Probably shouldn't be doing this on them yet because they're just a little bit tacky, and that's probably going to mess up some of the shine. Okay, and that takes care of the studs. Okay, so now we can move on to the knee armor. Now let's get to work on these knee armor pieces. The first thing you want to do is take a ruler, preferably one that's not as long as this one. And you want to measure, it might be easier to do this looking down from here. You just want to measure about 1 1/4 inches from the top and just make a mark. Now measure 1 1/4 inches from the bottom of it. I don't know if you can see if that's 1 1/4 inches, but it is. Mark that. There you go. And you should have between 1 1/4 and 1 1/8 inches between these two. And that's the distance that you're really looking for. This little tool that I made here is just a 1/2 inch curtain rod that I've taken sandpaper and a file, and I've just sharpened that edge so that it'll cut through the foam without any trouble. You can use a 1/2 inch drill bit, but this is what I did here, and it kind of tore up the front of it a little bit. It's mostly covered up, but still, like, this is probably going to be a lot cleaner. And this is just that same hose that we used for our little dart projectors. I've just cut about 1/8 of an inch piece of it, and I'm going to slide this onto here. This is there. And the reason why I have this is that I want to make sure that there's enough of a gap against this piece right here that it'll actually fit in there. So I want to center this as well as I can over my mark and push this so that the little bit of hose is, if not right up against the side here, then pretty close to it. So I want to have as much material on top of this as possible. And then I'm just going to push down and twist this. Oh, by the way, once you get a good imprint, you can lose the little bit of hose. Okay, and once you can feel it when it kind of cuts through that outside layer. And once it does that, I want to make sure that I'm going in as level, even with this top edge here, and even with this edge here going strong. I mean, you don't want it to go out like this way, or you don't want it to be like up like that. So I'm just going to check back and forth often. And it's not like a screw, you can go back and forth. I mean, you're just cutting.
Let's see, I was kind of going down like that. I need to make sure I get that up. I probably should have cut this a little bit longer so I could get a better grip on it. Okay, so I'm down that far. I'm just going to check that compared to here. And I'm almost there, but I want to give it a little bit of extra. It's probably better to make sure that it's even with this line than it is to make sure that it's not sticking a little bit out. Okay. And don't try to pull this out because it's, you know, pretty weak right here. You don't want to tear any of that. Okay, so now I just have some needle nose pliers. Earthquake. Kind of helps to twist. Go in, grab, and twist. Give this a little test. It's a little bit snug just because I sharpened the outside of this. If I'd sharpened the inside of it, it would be a larger hole. But this is going to work fine, and this will help hold it in place. It's almost there. I need to go in just a little bit more. Probably should have grabbed a little bit larger pair of pliers, but and there we go. Let's go ahead and do this one now. Put my little ring on there. You know what, I think I'm going to sharpen this real quick. After you do this a few times, it can kind of dull it out. Make sure the edge isn't pushed in. I already had a little bit of an edge cut in there, so I don't really need to have that little bit of flexible tubing anymore. Okay, it cut through quite easily this time. Once again, I want to make sure that this is, in fact, I might want to just put this back in real quick. It's going to make it harder to get a hold on this, but it'll make it easier to line the angles up. I think I'm going to do that. I'm going to take my little ring now. I'm going to slide it back here so that I don't push down and try to drill up. I could have marked on here how deep to go, and I probably should have. Okay, that looks plenty deep. Oh yeah, way more than is necessary. This is just the one that I made out of a dowel. I can kind of slide that in there and see how it looks. It looks pretty good. And then of course there's these. They just kind of screw in place. That looks quite good as well. And if you're interested in these, this is what the pack looks like. There are several that are similar to this, so you want to make sure that you get the 3/8 inch T. The entire description is a 5-piece 1/4 inch NPT
by 3/8 of an inch auto kit. It's the automotive style, and this is larger than most of them that you see. But the main things you want to look out for is to make sure that it's a T or an automotive, and that it's 3/8 of an inch, the plug coupler. This, for instance, is a different style. This is an industrial tip, I believe. And you can just see how it has a different look to it. And this one's also 1/4 of an inch instead of 3/8, I think. So you just want to make sure that you get the one that looks like that. Get a good look at it. You know, I kind of like the look of the two different lengths on there. But I just wanted to show you a comparison before you just completely don't like the idea of using these little couplers. Let's do a little comparison here. I mean, one thing that's nice about them is they end right at that line, which looks like it's intentional. They're also shorter, so if there's any variations in, you know, the holes, they're not going to be as noticeable as the longer. You know, any slight angle difference is going to be more noticeable with a longer piece. So that's more what the film has. So, I mean, it's totally up to you. The more I look at them, the more I kind of like the combination of the two, but you know, if you want to, this is more accurate to what the movie prop is, and this I think maybe looks a little bit better in real life. For this one, this is the left, and it should have two that are the same. This is the right, and it should have one that's like this on the bottom, and then of course you have the one that's just kind of a blunt ended point at the top, and it should go out roughly to this point here. So the top of this should stop where this little bulge stops, which means we need to cut our ones that we just did to be the right length. Okay, so here we have our pieces. We want to cut these to the right length. So what I'm going to do is, I know it's supposed to end right there, so I'm just going to line these up where they're supposed to be, and then I can put a mark, you know, right where the bottom of this is. So I'll just hold that there and put a mark. Just check it again real quick. Yep, looks good. So I can cut that right there, and it'll be the right length. The question comes in, what length should it be if you're going to use these? So if we put that in there, let's see, I think I've got a fairly large hole in this thing, so I should be able to slide it back. Somewhat. You know, if you really want it to be shorter, it probably needs to be shorter than that. So I'm going to cut about 1/4 of an inch off the bottom of this real quick. Yeah, I don't know. That's kind of the equivalent. I'm not sure I really like that or not. It just seems like it's barely sticking out. I mean, it almost looks better if it's the same length. It's kind of hard to decide. I definitely don't like it when it's super short.
I mean, in this, that would barely allow anything to show except for that one little bit of gnarled, which isn't bad. Yeah, go like that. I think I'd be tempted to make them the same length. Oh, that's not bad either. It's a tough one. So I think definitely if you're going to use just the spike, I would make it, you know, that long, or of course use the other piece. You know, that looks pretty good. So I think what I'll do at this point is I'm going to go ahead and cut this one the same size as this one. And I'll be right back. Okay, so this is basically what I've decided to go ahead and do. I'm using the pneumatic coupler at the top here and the standard, you know, Boba Fett dart projector here. I'm using also the standard one here, but instead of just the spike, I'm using the center punch there. Now make sure you take all the internal parts out of this before you cut it. I'm pretty sure you would have already done that, but just in case. I like this, but you know, honestly, I think it would look just as good if I just used the two couplers on this side and a coupler and that on this side. It wouldn't have had the, you know, the larger in the bottom and the small at the top on each side, but you know, they would have been sort of even on both sides, and I think that would have been just as symmetrical. And of course, you could also go with the, you know, the standard with two of these on one side and one on this side with, you know, just the standard spike. I like this because it just doesn't, it looks more like an instrument or something that, you know, does something as opposed to just a metal spike sticking out. But you know, it's up to you, it all works. So let's see about putting these in permanently. So to glue this, you could use lots of different things. A 5-minute epoxy would be probably a really good choice. You just want to test the epoxy itself on a piece of your EVA foam just to make sure that it doesn't affect it in any way. Something like the Incredible Goop or some of this E6000 probably be a good choice. These take about 24 hours to completely cure though, and I have had Goop and E6000 dissolve foam. I've never tried it with the EVA foam, so it might still work just fine, but once again you want to test it on the foam just to make sure that it doesn't react with the foam. You could get away with super glue. I'm sure that would be just fine, or you know, any kind of cyanoacrylate glue. I think what I'm going to go with is this Fast Dry DAP. This is the same stuff that I use when I'm smoothing out the EVA foam, so I know for a fact that it will stick to this foam. It'll also fill in any gaps and give a nice, you know, good hold. So I think I'm just going to go ahead and go with this. Plus, I know that it's, you know, it's reasonably quick. It may not completely cure for, you know, 24 hours or so, but I know that it'll have a really good hold within 20 minutes. Kind of hesitate to handle these pieces too much because the paint is still just a little bit tacky, and so I know that every time I touch it, it's taking some of the shine off of it. So it really needs to, you know, weight that full. It's not so much the chrome part, it's the glossy black paint underneath, I'm pretty sure. Because that is much, much stickier. In fact, you can see where there's some silver come off my finger than this that didn't have any of the black paint. Okay, so I'm just going to take some of this and I'm just going to, you don't want to put too much. Now, all these pieces are hollow, so you can put a fair amount in here. If you're going to do one with, the pieces that are solid on the bottom, you want to put a lot less in there, because if it can't get out, you're not going to be able to push your part in far enough. So I just want to put a fair amount in. That's probably too much, but since these are hollow in the middle, they'll probably be okay. Okay, so this is the left. So I've got this piece goes on the bottom. That should be just fine. And then this goes in the top. Make sure that I don't have that stamped in size visible, and it is. So let's rotate that to the back. Make sure everything's pointing the way it should point. That looks good to me. I think I may put even a little bit more in here, just because that was such a non-issue. It's usually famous last words. Now it's going to be a disaster. And let's see. Bottom gets this. Make sure the small bulge is to the back. Sorry, I keep moving things off of the screen. This I'm going to push further than I want, and then I'm going to pull it back just a little bit, just because it tends to pucker that edge. Once again, I'm going to make sure that everything is pointing the direction that it needs to. And I think that also looks good. And that's pretty much it. We'll wait for this to cure, then we'll take a look at it. Well, the caulking has completely cured and everything is still where it's supposed to be and pointed in the right direction, so I'm going to declare this job successfully completed. Hey, if you like this video or found it helpful, why not go ahead and give it a thumbs up? And of course, subscribe so you don't miss out on any of the upcoming videos. You can also click that little bell so you'll be instantly notified when new videos come out. As always, if you have any comments or questions, please leave them down below in the comments section and I'll do my best to answer them. You know, it's really your likes, comments, and subscriptions that motivate me to keep this channel going. So until next time, thanks.